Thank you for joining us to another Central Elevation webinar. My name is Nando Mogollon, and today we will be covering the issue of context, civil, and landscape works within the process of coordinating projects using IFC models. My name is Nando Mogollon again, and today we'll be covering exactly the following points. We'll take a look at the context of a building, but when I take a look at that, making sure that we clarify what is an existing reference that you just use just for the sake of having a little bit of a context around your building, so you know where the surrounding buildings will be and what's the nature of the roads and limits of the site overall. But we also want to take a look at that from within the concept of having another discipline in the project who's actually running the design and works of both, or separately or together, civil and landscape works. Now, we're going to take a look at a couple of models where I'll try to identify the two different things. And while we're doing that, the thing we actually want to achieve is to show you how to identify the IFC elements when you receive them or when you export them, when they mean to be just for context. At the same time, we want to identify which of those individual items that are not for context, but actually for the purpose of a designed landscape or design civil works around your building, how to identify those, even if they're just what IFC calls building element proxies. Those proxies are essentially some type of element that IFC cannot classify otherwise. So it is not a building part, not a wall, not a slab, not a ceiling. Therefore, it just calls that a proxy, meaning that essentially it doesn't know what it is. But there is a way to identify those, and that's where we want to focus the effort of today. And then, of course, we're going to take a step back and take a look at Archicad and how to translate those bits and pieces for landscape and civil if you're doing those inside Archicad. We know that most of you will be executing the design for the building itself, but in case you need to have a say or have an indication, or if you're a landscape architect or you work for a landscape architectural firm and using Archicad, then there are ways for you to collaborate with others by using IFCs, even if the IFC is not meant to be for that particular purpose. Remember, IFC mainly builds with building parts, and only in the latest iterations of the IFC schema and format, they're starting to include civil works in the whole thing, mainly for infrastructure. But still, there are ways to work around those limits, and those are things we want to show you today. So what you see there on your screen is essentially just a concept of a building. It's not even built of bits and pieces. It is mainly just a morph, just for the sake of having something, since we're not going to focus on that today. On the other side, what we have is a context that right now consists essentially of a larger mesh that essentially give us the context of a building, just a square, but I have a few control points for RLs that were given to me by the surveyor. And if we're interested in that, we covered that bit last year. We'll cover that again at some point this year. But let's say we understand how to bring that in. Now, within the site, we actually have my own property. So this is the land that we have for the project. And within that land, we actually want to affect some of the design. We probably want to, do some adjustments to the site just to make sure that we can fit in the building. And we have banks and retaining walls and everything else that we may need to do there. We also have, and this is typical of both civil and landscape, you may have areas of softscape like so a couple of patches of grass in there or planting areas, and pavers or hardscape bits and pieces that may be done or may require a little bit of construction. By all means, we've got also a few trees around there just to give it a little bit of context, but that's essentially what it is. Now, from this point, there are two things that you need to recognize on your building. And this is why I've clearly identified those two different pieces, mostly with these two different items or two different parts. On one side, I have the context of the building that I'm never going to affect. I'm never going to touch it because it's not even part of my property, right? And those are going to be this surrounding area that falls outside my property line and includes typically things like a road or a sidewalk. It might include a building around, or the 3 or 4 of whatever number of buildings you have around your own property, and that'll be okay. Anything else that might be infrastructure around your building, that could be context. The essential criteria there to identify what is context is based on the idea of what are you going to affect, what are you going to design or modify. And then what I have here inside my property area, I'm going to consider that landscape works. Now, it might be that that's something that I'll do if I have a small project and I think it's enough for me just to handle it. It might be part of what you do. If it's delegated to a third party or a different company or different landscape architect, then that's going to go to their work. All right, so that's what you get from within Archicad. And now let's take a look at what you usually get when, not knowing any better, you simply go ahead and export your file without taking care of the different items that you may have in there. So now we're jumping. Let's say if you've got that into IFC, we're not going to go into the details of that. We want to focus on the outcome and how to modify the outcome. So I have just exported the entire project. That's why I have it there as an entire project. Probably have noticed I'm using a slightly different viewer this time. I'm using BIMCollab Zoom. It doesn't really matter which viewer you use, as long as you use a viewer where you can open the IFCs and interrogate those IFCs for the sake of knowing what's going to be shared with the other disciplines. So if I happen to share this thing, what I'm going to get is the project itself, a site that is classified as what our IFC understands to be an IFC site or simply site. And you see how it actually gets everything except the building, because that is the typical way Archicad, if done within Archicad, will export those elements regardless of how you bring them into the IFC. If you classify them as site elements, they're not going to be part of the project. They're going to be part of the container that is the IFC site. In there, I have included the trees, the pavers, the grass, and the general context. And then inside there, I'll have the building. So if I isolate the building, I'll take everything that is considered to be a site outside of here. Now, one word of advice. When done in this way, what you're effectively getting, or let's say what you're effectively assuming, is that everything that is in there, essentially the site but not the building, is just context. There is no way in terms of IFC to manipulate, consider, quantify, organize, request any information of geometries that are considered to be site. They are understood to be just context. You're never going to touch it. You just need it for reference, if you like. So, as you can guess, this might be a good idea, but only for the stuff that is the actual site. Everything that's inside, the grass area, the trees, those pavers, I actually want to consider that part of my project. But I just know that they don't need to be part of my building because they're two separate things. Okay, so that's going to take us to if that's a way in which you're going to identify what its context and what is part of your discipline, then we're going to have to do this in a different way. But we still need to have both. We just need to be able to identify them correctly. So what do you use when using IFC sites or simply sites is not the right answer. So to do that, I've already done something inside Archicad, which I'll show you just now. All right, we're back in. And what I've done in here is I've gone ahead and instead of using, let's say that's a mesh, you'll see that the mesh in here, it's been classified as simply as a terrain. Instead of using terrain for the property, the land that I have purchased or the land that my client has purchased, that I will now use something else called civil element. Now, when you do that inside Archicad, effectively what you're using, it's a different way to translate that into the IFC model that we're going to share, right? So I know, by being using Archicad and stuff that it might be useful for you to know, I know that the civil elements will not fall into the IFC site type of entity. That's something that if you're interested, you can double check the IFC translators. I'm using a standard IFC 2x3 coordination view. As you can see, 2x3 is the schema. Coordination view is the model view definition. And then within there, you can check the type mapping. That type mapping is the one that will translate the Archicad classes into IFC classes. Usually you don't need to mess up with this. It's just, it's the kind of thing that it's already done for you. So you need to come in and manipulate much unless you actually need it and if you know what you're doing. So what I want to show you here is just how the things are connected in between Archicad and the resulting IFC. So anything that is on the site, or most of the stuff that is on the site, will get classified as an IFC site, as you can see there. The terrain is IFC site, flora and fauna, IFC site. With a predefined type, but still an IFC site. Therefore, its parametric properties and attached information won't be much usable when you're coordinating the project. The civil element, on the other side, it's actually classified as a building element proxy, which is that particular thing that IFC doesn't really gives a particular meaning to. So it could be anything. Now, not having a specific item type for anything that is civil and landscape, and that probably is going to come in the future, not having anything better, what we can use is that particular translation that classifies that as a thing and use a predefined type called civil element. That'll be enough. In that case, what you're going to get then, when translated in that way, if I go ahead and take all of these elements and just tell them that they are supposed to be either, civil elements or flora and fauna. Well, in this particular case, we're looking for civil elements. And let's say let's bring in the IFC version of this. If I go ahead and tell them all that, yeah, you're going to be actual civil elements, then I should be able to export yet another IFC different to the building that's going to be the landscape or civil works. So in order to do that, I've created separate views for this. So I've got the initial one, which is the entire project, and exporting all at once, which is giving me as a result something that I'm not really keen to get, which is that all merge of things into the IFC side. But instead, now I have split this in two. So I have just the building. And on the other side, you have just the landscape. And the one thing that I'll do is make sure that I get the elements correctly classified so that when I export the two, I can manipulate the landscape as if it was not only context, but actually part of my project and something that I can either manipulate myself or delegate into to someone else. So exporting those will result into a combined file of this kind. Let's go back to this, of this kind, where now what I have is the architectural building model, that one there. You'll notice that even though it has the IFC site, which is the container of the building, the site itself has no geometry. So there's no geometry associated to this, and that's completely fine, as long as I get the building isolated from the rest of it. And then on the other side, I have a landscape works file. Now, that landscape work file has been translated in a way that I get from one side the context, and I've done something there that you will need to fix. So we have the site around, which is essentially the context. I may have a couple of buildings around, and I have the road, but honestly, I'm not going to affect the road, so that might be something we'll need to fix. And the trees as well. Let me highlight that again. Trees are part of the site, but opposite to what's happening with the road, I may need to modify the trees. I may want to say, we need to move this one, we're going to plant a new one, etc., etc. Now, everything else, my own land plus the different pieces of grass that I'm planning to propose in there, plus the pavers, they're all coming in as part of the building. So now if I separate the so-called, and this might be wrong in terms of naming, since IFC doesn't really consider anything to be landscape or civil, anything that falls into the building is actually part of the project. So it will be part of the landscape project. So when I look at that isolated, I have the items that I should be modifying, right? In this particular case, I'm missing the trees and I have a road that I'm really not keen into modifying. But at least I have a say over everything else that's happening there. And they're coming through, hope you can see it down here, as other, which is Beam Collapse Zone's way of saying that that's a proxy. So it doesn't really have an entity associated to it. So not a wall, not a window or anything like that. And on this other side, we've got something in here that tells me, this Archicad classification, that this is a civil element, right? I can use other things. I can see the model name. I can also see the name of the item, which is, in this particular case, coming from the element ID. But essentially what I'm interested here in to see is to see that it's actually being classified with a type that comes from the translation plus a classification. Now, I need to show you where those are coming from, and I'll then refresh this file so you see that it's not very difficult to manipulate and keep working on these landscape works if you need to. So let's go back to Archicad. And now we're going to show you through the translation and the different things that you change in your file, how to make those changes and how to make that happen. So first thing you saw was that those the land plus the grass patches and the pavers were already classified as civil elements, but not the trees, and probably the road had a wrong classification. So let's start with the trees, right? So these trees in there are just objects, nothing different from within inside Archicad. They just have the wrong classification. The wrong classification because they're coming from a legacy item where we used to call this just an IFC site, and therefore they land inside the container for site. So now what I want to do is take that and classify that as a civil element. That's going to turn them into simply a proxy. But at least they're going to come up on the other side with a classification that tells me that there's something else rather than a building part. That will do the work for those that I want to include now. And for the road, I actually want to do the opposite. The road is currently, it's currently being classified as a C element, which kind of makes sense. But for the purpose of what we're doing, which is make sure that that whole thing goes into the context, not the project of landscaping or civil works, then I'm just going to go and take that and move it into terrain, or move into any of the other items that I know will be dropping this element as a side. Could be terrain, could be side geometry. Let's call it side geometry, if that will do. So doing that change, doing these changes for these trees will now result in a better IFC for the sake of landscape, where now the trees will be part of the project and the road will be part of the context. So, and then there's one more thing that is missing there that you need to know in order to understand how that's going across. The next thing that I do, and this is more of a trick, I will say, than anything that is a standard or common practice accepted or proposed by any organization, but it's a way in which you can still make it work without having to go outside the regular tools that we use inside IFC to identify elements. So when I export this as a landscape project, I'll have the problem of receiving proxies on the other side, but not knowing exactly what they are if they're not classified accordingly. So one thing that we can use, depending on the country you are, depending on the local standard classification systems, is to use an additional classification system, which I have in here inside Archicad. Let's show you this. And that I have added to my project. Since we're in Australia, we'll use NatSpec for it. And you'll see that NatSpec has a bunch of different chapters and subchapters to classify items, including site, urban, and open spaces. So within that, you'll find multiple other classifications of things that, since they may not affect the IFC entity chosen for the IFC resulting model, but they will give me an indication of what the item is in a standard manner without me having to come up with something completely new for this particular project. I can just simply go ahead and use something that is existing. And you'll be safe knowing that, well, most other companies should be aware of the NatSpec classification system. So if they're aware of that, they might be able to use it from their side and identify those elements accordingly. So the only reason why I'm using that is to get those items, say the property land, and go into the classification system and classify them within the Archicad classification for the sake of having a resulting IFC entity, and within the NatSpec classification system for the sake of being able to identify that in any particular way, since the only thing that the IFC is giving me is a proxy. So now that particular site, I may say that is it's a landscape structure, or it is a preparation groundwork might do. I don't know. I'm not really familiar with that to the extent that I can choose one of those particular items, but I can tell that that's going to give me an indication of what that might be. Say, for instance, that tree. You may want to go, actually, let's go and select all of them. You may want to go there and say, all right, they're going to be planting in annual trees or something else within those lines. Might be something inside here too. Landscape cultivation, landscape planting. Let's say that's a better classification for that. All right. If you're happy with it, then all we really need to do is go back to my publisher, where I'll select just the landscape works, make sure that I publish that. Should get in through rather quickly. Close that. Let's go back to my file. And from within here, I'm just going to update that link. There you go. So now what I've got is landscape works. where the site is the context and also the road, which is exactly what I was looking for. And the building, which is the project of the landscape works, actually includes the trees. And if you're interested in identifying what kind of element that is, it's obviously a tree, but some other cases you may need to have a better idea of what that is, then you know that you'll have that classification system coming through right here as a landscape planting under section 0253 of the NatSpec classification system. You can use a bunch of other things. You can use the type, the element ID, even the layer if that helps. But of course, all of those items are essentially custom made by any company, while the NatSpec classification system is a standard per different regions. Well, NatSpec being a standard for Australia. New Zealand might be another one, and in other countries, of course, different things. But now I have clearly separated landscape works as a separate building or separate model from the building itself. So coordinating the two is rather easier done this way, and then you don't need to mix them up, and you're still keeping the context for the building itself, which is not necessarily just the area that you're going to affect. All right, that's what I want to show you for today. Let's go back to the presentation for a moment. So if you have any questions, by all means, send us an email. If you've got an interest on following up on the next webinars, please use that link on the screen. That's going to take you to an online calendar that keeps updated. If you're using your mobile phones, you can use that QR code on the screen as well. Again, you can get regular help if you're still under subscription for Australia and New Zealand with both email addresses as on the screen, or logging a ticket into MyCI online. Thank you for subscribing and keeping an eye on this webinar. Next week, we're going to continue with this trend. We're going to keep looking at other non-building IFC entities. In this particular case, we'll try to focus on interior works, which is also one of those areas where the IFC schema, it's a little bit lagging, not having enough entities to represent what we typically have in there. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.